When you're all done your 3-day remote fantasy draft, there's a backyard full of crabgrass for you to mow. Hi everyone, this is Will O'Toole for Park Ridge Sports History, welcoming you to another edition. And as always, I have to thank first Howard Fredericks for allowing me to do these shows, but also for allowing me the privilege of coming into your homes each week and talking nothing but sports history. And today, since we just had, in my family anyway, we do a fantasy football draft, I just thought that it would be fun, not so much to talk about who you took in the draft and all the rest of it, but since this is full, a kind of a sports history type of show, I'd like to take the opportunity and maybe reminisce about some of the great quarterbacks, just the quarterbacks, and one particular hero of mine from the old days of football in the 60s and the 70s, and where they might be in a fantasy football's drafts moment, or where they would come in the draft. Now, I have to tell you, I'm not an expert, certainly not an expert, especially on fantasy football. In fact, as I'm going to quote unquote taping today, I have to remove a couple of my players already because they're hurt and didn't even realize it. So you know where I'm going to finish my 10-person or 10-member league this year. I think I'm going to be a bottom feeder without a doubt. And it's funny because every year you think that you have the ultimate strategy to draft that fantasy football or baseball or certain players and people play hockey and basketball. But you always get that feeling come April and come September that you know you are absolutely the most knowledgeable fantasy football player. And then some joker comes out of nowhere in your league and they just blow everybody out of the water. Or the guy that you think is going to be, let's say, that Cinderella player in the making, that everybody overlooks, and they either bottom out or it just never comes to fruition. So your scouting acumen is out the door. And then, of course, there always seems to be one guy, and you always say, it's luck. It's luck. The guy knows nothing about football. He probably drafted the guy because of the color, or he just liked the color of the uniform, or he liked his first name or something like that. And they wind up winning. And you don't even have a chance to play them in the championship round. So I'd like to go into a few players that I thought would be very interesting and maybe even bring up some debate as to, let's say, how much money or what their worth was. And let me just point them out first of all. I'm going to start with a guy that everybody knows from the 60s. And I would consider, and I'm going to just show him as I'm doing this. I just want to fold this up so I kind of save some of the surprises. But Bart Starr, of course, I think, especially during the 60s, he's one of the most significant players. Bart Starr, I love this football card. And I'm not an expert on the year with the tops, but this is definitely around 65, 66. And of course, there's the Packer logo that we talked about a couple of weeks back, and of course the helmet, the Green Bay helmet, and you can get a pretty good idea of the jersey. But Bart Starr is an interesting player for fantasy football, and the reason being is this. Now we have to take it in context of the times. Remember that football of the 60s was more run-oriented, less pass-happy, and certainly the defenses weren't as handcuffed as they are today, because today they really want almost pinball machine-like scores. Probably the highest rated game last year was that Kansas City LA Ram game where it was about 52-49, and it was back and forth, and the fans just seemed to love that. And so often fans don't seem to like the 10-7 just brute force defensive struggles that we get. For instance, that Super Bowl a couple of years ago that the Patriots won, I think it was over the Rams. Look, I'm not even going to get into what the score was. It was a low-scoring defensive struggle. Now, people thought it was boring. I actually thought it was pretty good because it seemed like each series, each defense was really pressured to stop the offense. Unlike most times where the offense has to come down and just score just to be one up. And sometimes in those offensive-minded games, they cannot be stopped with a field goal. Notice what I said. Even though they're getting points on the board, they can't be stopped with a field goal. That championship game, or the Super Bowl a couple of years back, reminded me of a national championship game. This was before they were called national championship games, between Paterno's Penn State Lions and the old Miami Hurricanes with Jimmy Johnson. That game was 14-10, I think, and it wound up with an interception to end the ball game by Penn State. And that was a real defensive struggle. Vinny Testaverde didn't see that type of defense that the Nittany Lions had that year, and he was just totally flustered. Miami turned the ball over a number of times in that game, and it's more credit to the Nittany Lion defense. Anyway, as I again go off on a tangent talking everything football, but this time college football, I would wonder where Bart Starr might wind up in the in terms of the draft. I doubt he would be a number 1 or a number 2 or a number 3 draft pick if you were doing, let's say, a round robin type of thing where I had the first, and if there was only 8 guys in the league, I would have the first and then the 8th pick, and then 2, 7, etc., 3, 6, 4, 5. I doubt that Bart Starr would be, if we were just going for the best player with the best stats, he would be up there. Bart Starr is much like Tom Brady in this respect. They're both winners. I think Starr actually lost only one championship game. That was 1960. And in fact, Lombardi always blames himself for that. And he said if we ever got to that spot again, we'd never lose. And he was actually right. Bart Starr quarterbacked the Packers with efficiency, with economy, but it wasn't lights out statistics where he threw for 550 yards and 8 touchdowns, etc. Bart Starr really was a general, really just like Brady, an extension of his head coach on the ball field. And in fact, this is the beauty. You know, they always talk about that Ice Bowl game. And I always bring up the fact with the Ice Bowl, and I think this really goes to the confidence that Lombardi showed in his quarterback. Remember, he basically took, when Lombardi assumed the reins of the Packers, Paul Hornung was the quarterback, and he realized right away that he had a guy sitting on the bench who may not have had the celebrity, the charisma, and maybe the athletic abilities of a Hornung. But he also knew that if he moved Hornung to a halfback position and inserted Starr into the quarterback, he would be improved at both positions. Not that Hornung probably couldn't have thrown the spiral much farther, and he couldn't run faster, and that he probably ran faster than Starr. But you're taking a guy kind of like this. You're moving a guy from shortstop, who's a good defensive player, and moving him over to third base. Kind of like what the Orioles did with Brooks Robinson. Originally, he was going to be a shortstop. They moved him over to third. And, of course, Golden Glove almost every year. So, and then they were able to insert a low-hitting but a defensive genius in Mark Belanger at shortstop. Lombardi did the same thing with the Packers. He brings Starr off the bench, puts Hornung into a halfback role with Jimmy Taylor, and off the Packers go. I know that there's one head coach who would have loved to have had Horning as the quarterback instead of Starr. And that was Tom Landry of the Cowboys. Getting back to that ice ball. And this would never happen in today's sport. And that is, Starr comes over. They use their last timeout, but yet they have 2 plays to go, and they are on the goal line. And he basically says to his coach, he actually supersedes his coach, Lombardi, and says, look, I can do it. The guys keep slipping. I can get the ball in with just a quarterback sneak plunge. So Lombardi says, run it, and let's get out of here. Today, that I actually argue that play would never have occurred. And the reason being, with so many coaches being so, in their philosophy, corporate. And what I mean by this is that I think too many of the coaches today, and maybe this is why Belichick really stands out, is that they're corporate in that they're afraid to make mistakes instead of saying, let's just chance it and let's go for broke. And actually, here's what I mean. If that set of circumstances with Green Bay at the goal line with the Cowboys in the 67 ice ball, that had occurred today, the Packers would have rolled out more than likely twice, thrown the ball. On third down, they might have run the ball, but then called a timeout if they didn't make it, and then kicked the field goal to tie it and send it into overtime. And who would have chastised them? After all, they're the home team. They had never lost a championship game in Green Bay, as far as my knowledge. And of course, I could be wrong on that. I'm pretty sure it was the Falcons who were the first team to beat them in a playoff game at Lambeau Field. Anyway, they would have probably kicked the field goal, and most fans and football pundits and most coaches would have said, let's send it into overtime. We're the home team. We know that Dallas, not used to this kind of cold. Not that the Packer players were, but they were, let's face it, more used to the cold than the Dallas Cowboys from Texas were. And they probably would have outwilled the Cowboys in overtime. And yet, that kind of play, that kind of leadership by Bart Starr really doesn't show up in fantasy football. It's a line plunge. He gets the 6 points or so for the touchdown or however your league plays, and then off you go. Normally, Bart Starr wouldn't do that in a game. But in that particular moment, he seized the time and knew he was going to either be the hero or the GOAT. So kudos to Bart Starr. Another player that I'd love to talk about. So where does this get us? I think that Starr would not certainly be, as I stated, a number 1, number 2, or number 3 draft pick. He would probably go as almost like, all right, I have to take Starr. I know he's a great player, but he's not going to get me the stats that another great player of the 60s might, like a Fran Tarkenton or a Don Meredith. Another great player I'd like to go over. And I'm going to go to the AFL now. And actually, I just picked this up. Maybe it's subconscious. How about Len Dawson? Now, this is in old Kansas City. But Len Dawson was from Purdue. He originally played for Pittsburgh, I do believe, in the NFL. But really became a Hall of Famer with the Kansas City Chiefs. And Dawson, I would say this. More than likely, Dawson is the type of player that would be not just a good field general in the real game, but he might be a more attractive fantasy football player simply because the AFL opened up the game. And he took full advantage of it. And he had some great players, among them Otis Taylor, that he could throw to. You know, Starr had fair wide receivers. He had Otis Taylor. So Dawson would be an excellent, probably, I don't know, you might be able to sneak him in as a number 2 round pick if you were bidding for him coming off, let's say, the 69 season, going into the 1970 season. I know that the Chiefs had the Super Bowl. Remember, though, that he does get hurt in that 69 season. Regardless, though, he had a very productive season in 69, and he might be very attractive, although he would be a little bit older. Although, the funny thing is, when it comes to quarterbacks, as opposed to other positions like running back in today's game, and that's another thing, running backs would have been big premiers, but I just want to keep it with the quarterbacks. Running backs aren't as important simply because they're not getting the ball as much. It's always in the hands of the quarterback, but if you just take a look at the statistics, even on the college game, they're throwing more than 60%. Some of these teams are throwing 80% of the time in some cases. Same is true for the most part in the NFL. And who can blame them? They have so many speed demons at wide receiver. And of course, now with the tight end becoming more and more of a receiver and less of a blocker, and the realization that you can check off and just dump it off to your tight ends, and they have terrific speed now, these tight ends. They're big, they're strong, and they're fast. And they've actually become the fullback position when you think about. And instead of getting a fullback getting maybe 3.5 yards on a carry, these guys are getting maybe 5 or 6 yards per play, which doesn't seem like a lot until you realize what? They're getting double the number of yardage, and you're getting it in basically half the plays. So Len Dawson took full advantage of the AFL and its passing rules. And I think that, obviously, if you were taking Len Dawson or Bart Starr, 60 competitors, contemporaries, Dawson, even though that people would probably say which one's the real not so much which one's the real Hall of Famer, but when you think of Hall of Fame first, you're probably thinking of Starr. If you're thinking of the quarterback to lead your team, you're probably thinking Starr over Len Dawson. But this is fantasy. You're probably taking Dawson over Starr. Here's a guy, and the reason I bring him up is that he was a player who had an unbelievable season in 1969. In fact, he becomes the NFL MVP that year. And just to give you an idea, his name is Roman Gabriel. There he is in actually the away uniforms, early 60s, about 65, I would say, for the Rams. He's an interesting player because in 69, when he wins the MVP, he threw 24 touchdown passes. I'm just doing my football reference, sports reference, great site. I either use this or sometimes the Baseball Almanac for baseball, but two great sites that I do my research. This is the football reference. 24 touchdowns. Now, why I say this, he's a kind of guy, Roman Gabriel, that wouldn't probably in many years get a lot of publicity in the fantasy football. He certainly wouldn't be your first choice in the of the contemporaries of the 60s. As I said, the Fran Tarkentons or the Joe Namaths or the Don Merediths. I was about to say Don Maynard. Boy, oh boy, there's a slippage. Gabriel would be one of those guys, especially in 69, that would probably go maybe later in the rounds. And if you got him, you might be a little bit upset, even though he had a good season the year before, and the Rams were a pretty good team. But basically, Roman wasn't seen as a big-time superstar. But if you had locked him in 1969 in your fantasy football, you got the MVP of the league. 24 touchdowns. He threw for 2,500 yards, which was with the exception of 1973, that was the high watermark of his career. You got to remember, 2,500 yards, 14 games. That's about 100 some odd yards a game. Today they're throwing 3 times as much, that over 300 yards a game. But Consider it in context. Gabriel had a pretty good wide receiver in Jack Snow. He had a kind of never a big running back. He had kind of a succession of running backs who had good seasons, one good season, then left, or were never the same. I'm thinking of guys like Willie Ellison. And of course, that season, you would have been even happier because the Rams, here's the thing with the Rams of 69. They got off to an 11-0 start. I'll never forget it. And they played a Sunday afternoon game in early December. This is when the NFL ended its season and started its playoffs before Christmas. And they were playing in the Coliseum in LA, and they got beat by the Minnesota Vikings, who, of course, would go on to the Super Bowl that year. The funny thing is, the Rams lost that game. They were 11-0, and they actually lost their last 4 games, and they were bookend on their losses. They lost to the Vikings during the season for their first loss, and they were the last unbeaten team to be beaten that year. And then they lost to the Vikings in a tough, brutal game in Minnesota, 23-20. I always love seeing the highlights from that game, or if you turn on the YouTube, the mud, the cold, and it really was. The Rams were close, and basically the Vikings just held on at the end, winning it late, or pretty much taking over the lead late in that game. But if you had Roman Gabriel, and he was harassed that whole game, by the way, but if you had Roman Gabriel in 1969, here's what's interesting about him. He was he threw at a 54% completion rate. Again, the second highest in his career. Now, the interesting thing is the Rams basically gave up on him, and he goes to the Philadelphia Eagles. And in 73, in his first year with Philadelphia, he actually sets career marks in attempts with 460 and completions with 270, and he threw for over 3,000 yards, and he leads the league in touchdown passes with 23. Think about that today. You have him leading the league with 24 touchdown passes in 69 and 73 of 23. That comes in today's game, and of course, this is the push for more and more offense and the push for aerial attacks. But 23 touchdown passes, that might be in the middle of the pack in today's game. Think about that. So that's Roman Gabriel. Always loved the name. He went to North Carolina State. Pretty good quarterback, like I said. What defines him is that the Rams were known as the fearsome foursome. They had some good teams in the 60s, but you got to remember that the Rams in the 60s were stuck in the Coastal Division, along with San Francisco, which was kind of a 500 team, but starting to move up with John Brody, and they would be a force in the early 70s, San Francisco. And they also had Baltimore with Johnny Unitas, and they had Minnesota, which was getting better and better. But it was mostly the Colts that just always seemed to best the Rams in that Coastal Division. Plus, really, actually, I shouldn't say they had the Atlanta Falcons. I apologize. Whoop, bring it back here. I'm thinking Minnesota beating them twice in 69. But you understand my point is that they were always in the same division as Baltimore. It's like being the Red Sox. It's actually like being the Cleveland Indians of the 1950s. They had some really good teams. So did the White Sox. And you just knew. I mean, think about this. The Indians in 1954 basically had to win the most games all time at that point of any franchise in baseball just to beat the Yankees. And they only beat the Yankees. Anybody who said to you, if you won 111 games in the season, how many games do you think you would have won your division by? Most people would say 20, 25 games. You realize the Yankees in 54 won 103 games and finished 8 games back But you see my point. It took the Indians, a very good team with a great pitching staff, it took an unbelievable season to best the Yankees. Same thing with the Rams. They had a very good team, probably like B plus, A minus. But then you always had the Packers, who or you always had the Baltimore Colts, especially in their own division, who were just always just a notch above them. And the reason why I say that, well, let's face it. Of all the guys, I have to show you this. I'm going to show you this second. I saw this in a baseball book that my brother had gave me years and years ago for a birthday gift. No, a Christmas gift. And it was called the All-Time Baseball Card Collecting Book. And in it, they had the weirdest baseball cards from Topps, from the 40s on to the 60s and part of the 70s. And they had little essays about the cards. It was incredible. But right around the midpoint line of the book, as you're getting through it, and believe me, it's a belly busting kind of, it's really a funny book. It's about American culture of the 50s, growing up as a kid in the 50s, and the author, like me, always had the countdown for school starting on July 5th. Oh my goodness. I can't believe it's only 60 more days until school begins, that type of thing. But it was always about growing up. It's a great story about growing up and collecting baseball cards and having baseball as the #1 sport to play in your neighborhood. But anyway, right around midpoint, the authors say to you, hey, are you getting a little tired of these baseball cards? Have you fallen asleep? Have you drifted away? Have you closed the book? And then they present this picture of Johnny Unitas in the book. It's one of the funniest. And they remark, is his hair in too tightly? Is his hair in too tightly? Meaning, is it being pulled down into his skull? It's a great picture. It's a funny picture. I'm not making fun, certainly, of Johnny Unitas. It's a funny picture. But, of course, these are the kind of pictures we remember of Unitas, without a doubt. Johnny Unitas in that beautiful, simple Colt uniform. I was actually going to get him with the helmet on and the horseshoe, but I thought this was more fair to show him without. And no, that's just reflection off his hair. It's not a bald spot like I have on mine. No, this is that's football 1960s. And Johnny Unitas embodied 1960s football. You know, when you think about the 1960s, I know Unitas, everybody thinks about the 50s, but really, after that 58 game with the Giants, in which football takes off and really supersedes the interest of viewers at home of baseball, because football just took off. They always, many football scholars and pundits, football fans always remark that it was that 1958 game against the Giants where Alan Amici runs over the Giant defense for the win in overtime against the Giants at Yankee Stadium for the 58 championship. Many people feel that that was the catalyst that made professional football, the NFL, the #1 sport in America. And nobody can really argue with that when you consider that in the 60s, baseball had an offensive drought. Football was on the ascendancy. Not only that, but football, I think maybe people will argue with me, but football in the 60s, think about it. You had quite a few Midwestern cities and new cities on the make. I'm thinking of Dallas. I'm thinking of Cleveland. I'm thinking of Kansas City. I'm thinking of Oakland. These were kind of cities that were looked over by the other major leagues, and all of a sudden these places had their own teams, and they were good. They were good. And then, of course, football also had the Green Bay Packers, again, a small Midwestern city that had this national appeal. And I think one of the reasons is Lombardi comes from Jersey, goes out to Green Bay, and instantly makes that team into a winner. And if you notice, I think what captured the moment too, again, even in the East, kind of the overlooked city of Baltimore in between Washington, squeezed out by Philly and especially New York. They are very good. And the New York Giants, not so good. I mean, they make the playoffs in 63. They lose in the championship. They have one good season in 69. But the Giants are down. And, of course, the upstart Jets with Joe Namath are on the rise. So football provided, I think, in the 60s, a mix of the Davids, the Green Bays, and the Kansas Cities, the newbies, Dallas, and the established teams that were getting a look, or the established cities that were now starting to get a look, the Baltimores and the Oaklands. So, that being said, let us bring into the frame, here is, now, I was going to get, and I will show it to you, that's Dallas Cowboys Heisman Trophy winning quarterback Roger Staubach. And the reason I bring him up, and I'm showing him in the Navy uniform, this might be 63 when he wins the Heisman Trophy, and they lose to Texas in the Orange Bowl. It's a shame. They lost 28-6 in that game. It's a shame because theoretically, they probably had a chance for the national championship. And of course, the Army game is kind of, how do I say this? Well, it was played kind of in hushed tones, if I can say, because the President of the United States, John F. Kennedy, had been assassinated before that game was played. And then that game was played, and of course, it was an exciting game, but I don't think America was really prepared to become really juiced up and excited. But Staubach had an unbelievable season in 63, wins the Heisman, and leads Navy to probably their highest finish in the last 50 years, of course. They've had pretty good football teams in the last decade and a half. Got a great coach there, although I am not using the time allotted here to try to pronounce his name. I always mess it up, but I simply think that the Navy coach, and I'm going to Coach Ken, is probably one of the elite coaches in college football, without a doubt. What he's done with the talent that he can recruit is phenomenal. So, here's Roger with, I got to be honest with you, I'm showing this. It's not one of my favorite Navy uniforms. It's a little bit too ornate for me. I wish I could see the logo of the goat, the Navy goat. That's pretty cool. But I think there should be a little bit less gold in that. It just like jumps out at you. Although it is kind of cool, regardless. Here he is, though. Here is Staubach, of course, as we know him, Captain Comeback with America's team. Reason I bring up Staubach, without a doubt, his numbers are pale in comparison to today's quarterbacks, even for the worst teams in the league. But again, it's because Staubach he was really on the cusp in many respects of the run going towards the pass, because at that time that he played, and he retired in 79, you only have Don Coryell with both St. Louis, and then he goes on to San Diego, and it's Air Coryell. He's really opening up the offense. Of course, you have Bill Walsh, but he doesn't have a head coaching. He's going to bring in the West Coast offense a little bit later on with the San Francisco 49ers. Even Paul Brown, under whom Bill Walsh was mentored and coached with, doesn't have the offense, even though he's a brilliant mind. There's no question that Paul Brown had a brilliant mind, but he isn't even enamored, let's just say, of the pass happy. Of course, he had Otto Graham, but they weren't passing more than quote unquote 50% of the game. But Staubach has a great season. He leads the league. He's actually tied in 1973 with Roman Gabriel at 23 touchdown passes. The interesting thing with Staubach, I think he falls in the category statistically, although he has a 57% completion rate, which is excellent at the time. Just missed throwing for 3,000 completions. He threw for 22,700 yards. Now, how do I say that? Well, here's the interesting thing about Staubach, and this is how I know that the air attack was slowly evolving, is that his first year that he truly takes the helm of the Cowboys, 71, when they win the Super Bowl, and he's finally inserted by Tom Landry to take over the reins for the Cowboys. And he wrests the control of the team from Craig Morton. His offensive output in terms of passing yards go from 1,800 that year in 1971. They almost double in his last year of playing professional football. So he goes from 1,882 yards and he retires at 3,586. He doubled basically the output. That's how and each year, interestingly enough, he went up. He didn't go up and down like this at Dow Jones, but no, he kept ascending like an elevator. 2,400, 2,500, 2,600, 2,700. Yes, he does go slightly down, 2,620 by about 70 yards. All right, but it was more that Cowboy team of 77 wins the Super Bowl, so he's probably taken out for Danny White. All right. Nickel dime, he does go down, but then he ascends again to 3,500, which is amazing. And then he retires. He never threw for more than 20, never threw for 30 touchdowns, even with the advancement of 16 games. And he does play that last year, 16 games. The last 2 years actually was 16 games. Goes 11-5 as a starter. So Staubach, known as Captain Comeback, again, I have a feeling he would not be considered one of the great catches, no pun intended, of quarterbacks in a fantasy league. But theoretically, at the time, he was probably considered he would probably be considered a catch when you think about it, because the Cowboys were so good. So he couldn't help but have good numbers. Do I think he might have been a first-round pick? Absolutely, especially after winning the Super Bowl in 71. All right, time permitting, we got to bring up another guy. Not him, but Joe Namath, right in the middle. And of course, Namath is one of those guys, you're going to laugh, and everyone is going to... I kind of see Joe Namath's stats in this respect. He's almost like a Denny McLain. And that is, he had a couple of really wonderful years. Now look, Namath, I loved, absolutely loved Namath. I think he was great for the NFL. He definitely had charisma. He definitely had celebrity. He loved the platform. But that 68/69 Super Bowl, really, that was the pinnacle of his career. He had some other all-pro seasons, but he was really, really not the same as other great quarterbacks, statistically speaking, like a Staubach, like a Brady. But he has that 69 season. He's kind of a guy, like I said, Denny McLain. He had those great seasons in 68 and 69 where he wins the Cy Young. Of course, 68, he wins the 31 games that year. But outside of 68, 69, I know I'm going to get a lot of Jet fans who are going to be arguing and screaming with me. Just take a look at his stats. He actually threw for more interceptions than he did touchdowns. I know that's always a big deal. But what Namath has really is a story. And you have to admit, actually, he threw 220 interceptions and 173 touchdown passes. He does lead the league early in his career in yards, again in the AFL. He threw for over 4,000 yards in 1967. But he never led, well, I shouldn't say that. He leads the league in touchdown passes once with 19. But he never had 30. He led the league quite a bit. He led the NFL or the AFL in the years that he threw all those yardage, 3,300 to lead the league and then 4,000 to lead the league. He also had the highest amount of interceptions. But again, in context, Namath was tough. He really is. If you take a look at that 68 playoff game against Oakland, he's making tackles in that game and actually got hurt. I admire Namath from a football perspective. First of all, I think he's a good guy. I think he was an exciting player. Very talented. I think everybody knows the story about Namath. But outside of 67 and maybe 68, probably nobody would take a chance on him for one reason. You're always waiting for him to get injured. So he would not be a very good fantasy football player. Joe is a unique guy, I will tell you that. And here's our last two guys before we go on. He's not slinging Sammy Ball, but he's slinging Sonny Jurgensen. I had to get this. It's not, quote unquote, an official Topps card from the 1960s or 70s. I just love it because it shows the Redskins' 60s uniform. I love the spear. It's a very simple, again, outfit. I think it really resonates with old NFL fans. Sonny Jurgensen, though, was a funny player. He leads the league in touchdowns. He could throw a ton of interceptions. He always looked like he was the typical weekend warrior. He had a gut that looked like he spent a lot of time not just in the locker room but in the pub. But he was a leader. He was exciting. He loved to just throw the ball. And the interesting thing about Jurgensen is this. I'm sure Lombardi loved him. And I am sure that if Lombardi had had a chance, he would love to have been with Washington a few years longer. It would have been amazing what Sonny Jurgensen could have done. Not just as a fantasy football player from Lombardi, but as a real NFL quarterback under Lombardi. This is Will O'Toole thanking you again for allowing me to come into your homes and talking all things sports. I'll see you next week, and if you'd like to see more of my cartoons, they're on otoonscartoons.com. Thanks very much, and have a great week.